to AM Prime, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us this morning. I'm really excited for my next discussion. Something I've been wondering of for quite some time, and though you read so many articles and so many research papers and studies done on said topic that we're about to get into, you don't get that one-on-one conversation oftentimes. You don't get those perspectives or those arguments or opinions. You always get some analysis which in itself doesn't necessarily speak to. That's why I prefer one-on-one conversations, and that's why we have AM Prime. Now, I'm speaking about the decline of Standard English, and I am very cautious in even making such a statement, because there are those who argue that Standard English, particularly in the Caribbean, is not declining, but rather the language itself, for its survival, is evolving. Now, Standard English in the Caribbean is mainly used in writing and formal contexts. However, when it comes to oral communication, a dialect is oftentimes preferred. But generally speaking, there's no clear-cut sense of the continuum or what is the norm. So let's have a conversation about that this morning. I'm joined by an attorney at law, an individual who loves reading books. It's an individual who loves writing books now, an author. I'm joined by Ms. Celeste Mohammed this morning. Good morning, Ms. Mohammed, and welcome to the AM Prime.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. This is really going to be a very interesting discussion.
A very interesting discussion, and I'm going to put you straight to the point that I made in my introduction, and that is whether, in your opinion, are we seeing a decline in Standard English? And when I say decline, I'm talking about in written, in oral communication, or is it just evolving for the sake of the survival of the language?
Yes, that's an excellent question. As you said, it's one that has been very hotly debated. I think that we can't talk about the state of Standard English currently without understanding a bit of the history of English in Trinidad. And although English has been the official language of Trinidad since we became a British colony, which was around 1802, the truth is, Standard English has never been the most widely spoken language or used language in Trinidad. It never has been. So as you rightly said, in sort of everyday discourse, people would speak different varieties of English. There have always been multiple Englishes in Trinidad due to our history. At one point, French was the most widely spoken language in Trinidad. And so what you had developing, because of our history, first being Spanish, then being British, all of these French people coming in, the Indian indentured laborers, the Chinese, the Portuguese, what you had developing was a spectrum of Englishes, right? At the highest, what we call the highest register, being the Standard English that we would have been taught in schools immediately post, during the British time. And at the other end of that spectrum would have been almost unintelligible sort of patois or Creole. And in between those two poles, we learned how to slide and code switch depending on who you're talking to and what was the medium, whether it be written or oral. And I feel that what has been happening, this is just my guess based on observation, and so what has been happening is that we probably started off with a spectrum that was like this in terms of Englishes, and it's now become this because of globalization, because of the internet, because of the modern generation, and the modern Trinidad English includes influences from so many other places. And so what has been happening is that I feel like perhaps the most modern generations are losing the ability, or they don't have need to slide to the upper registers and to speak, and they don't have access to that learning of the standard British English that I or you or our foreparents might have had, because I'm not sure if the standard British English is the thing being taught in schools or is the standard being required. or if that has laxed.
Because of that spectrum and how that spectrum has widened or expanded in time gone by, who decides what is deemed as standard English, particularly as a Caribbean people? If we have so many influences, who then decides, well, this is the proper way to speak English? This is the preferred way.
That's another good question. And in my house, it has always been my mother who decides what is proper English.
My house as well.
Yeah, yes. But you're raising a good point, because I think even at the university now, it's a debated topic as to where is that highest form of English, because when in days gone by, you would turn on the radio and you would hear pronunciation. You'd hear words of almost like BBC presenters, right? What you hear on the radio now is very different, for the most part. So at one time, that was the standard that we were all trying to aspire to. I've heard that some schools have even changed their policies in terms of grading, so that you get graded on the content, not on whether your spelling and grammar and so are correct. So if the schools are sort of moving the standard, then where does it lie?
We're speaking about tertiary institutions. I know that in the United Kingdom and in the United States, universities have now adopted what they refer to as inclusive assessments, where you're absolutely correct. Rather than, an individual being marked for their spelling, their diction and their grammar, it's actually the content that is being focused on. But do we find ourselves, or could we find ourselves in a problem where we might, because of the expanse of communication, and though the basic English may remain the same, could this, to a certain degree, lead to communication barriers?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a practical aspect to it, in that, okay, if you go to a Hispanic country and you can't speak a word of Spanish, or you can't speak it well enough, you won't be able to communicate effectively. Same thing, if we continue to go in the direction of young people coming up, knowing how to sort of communicate in hieroglyphics by text, so all kinds of acronyms, BRB, IKR, whatever, and emojis, if that's how most of our young people are communicating, we might reach a point where we lose the ability to communicate, write, speak in the English that will make us able to connect outside of Trinidad and Tobago, and that's really where the practical problem arises. I don't know if you've ever encountered tourists or persons visiting who say that they went into a store, and they could not understand what was being said.
I've encountered tourists who said that our dialect, we tend to speak so fast that we mince our words, and it's very difficult to understand. So globalization is a factor to consider for the expansion of the spectrum, as you mentioned earlier. But then globalization is also a problem because of our communication with the outside world.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about being a Trinidadian, at least in the time when I grew up, was that ability to seamlessly code switch. So I would, in my home, my mother had, rules. So I would speak what we call proper English, and then I would go out and go in the country by my cousins or whatever, and I would speak a different kind of English, but I could make that transition seamlessly. I could write my exams in standard English. I could talk in, different fora, sliding seamlessly in between. But I think that is the problem. I'm not opposed to us using different forms of English, but I feel like we might be losing, some of us might be losing that flexibility and ability to code switch.
Well, that in itself is becoming a skill. As an author yourself, have you found yourself in that difficulty at times, whether it be in doing research or writing your own documents, your own stories, your own narratives?
Yes, and that's another interesting story. I grew up in a home where standard English had to be spoken. I went to schools where that was the requirement. Then I went off to study law, right? Which uses the most archaic and formal English possible, right?
Yeah.
I actually think it's a conspiracy so that normal people can't understand, you know. But anyway, so after all of that and 10 years practicing law, I go off to study creative writing in the US, which has a very informal approach to language. You know, they drop the U in words. They don't spell like we do, like British English, you know. So it was a shock to me at a tertiary level institution doing a higher degree, my master's in creative writing, to see how informal they were about English. So I ended up seeming like the weird one. And you know, my teacher saying to me, your the way you write is so formal, because that was what I was taught. So my early stories, I very much struggled to write in Trinidad Creole, because I had been taught that Trinidad Creole is never to be used for the written word. I struggled. I really did. And it was only when I was able to get past that sort of barrier, and let the characters speak for themselves, that I was able to write fluently in Trinidad Creole. And I'll tell you something, the first story of mine ever published, the first one to ever win an international award, is a story written entirely in Trinidad Creole.
Wow. Wow. Now, I hear what you're saying. There's something that piqued my curiosity, though, when you mentioned that you studied law, and they said they say you read for your degree when it comes to law, and then you decided to do a master's in English, and it's often suggested that that is the most difficult language to learn. What I'm just curious to know, not going off topic too much, but did you find your law degree more difficult to study or your master's in English?
Well, anything is difficult if you don't like what you're doing. So, from that perspective, I always wanted to be a writer. I had reasons why I went into law, and so I was competent at studying, reading law and getting the degree, but I didn't like it. My master's is not in English, it's in creative writing, which is learning to use the language for a particular purpose in a particular way, right? And my heart was there. I very much enjoyed doing that. But I will tell you something. Since then, since getting my master's in creative writing and pursuing a career in writing, writing is actually more difficult, the creative writing aspect, writing the books and all that. I think that is more difficult than practicing law. I really think it is, because you're trying to wield language as a tool to accomplish so many things, to accomplish, you know, an emotional reaction in the reader, in many readers. It is hard. It is harder than practicing law, but I love it so.
Well, there's always a love, which is very, very important in whatever you do. But moving forward now with the conversation, you know, the suggestion that your first international award for, you know, your written work, your written material, it was written entirely in Trinidad dialect, as we see.
Yes.
So that suggests that the attitudes are evolving as well to meet or match the evolution of English as we're referring to it. So then, is the decline of standard English something that we really need to be worried about if the attitudes itself are working to match?
Yeah. I don't know how pervasive it would be, an attitude of, yes, just come and speak whatever you speak. I don't know how practical or pervasive that would be, but I would say certainly in literary circles, there has been a move to accept and to honor and to give a certain pride of place to languages and versions of English that are other than standard. I don't know if that's because, it's like an exotic thing. Oh, look at this story written in some weird form of English. I don't know if that's what it is or what, but I will say that in literary circles, there is now a space for you to write in something other than standard English. But I will also add, there's a trick to it. You have to learn how to write in what appears to be Creole or something other than English, but it actually, and V.S. Naipaul talks about this in his work, there's a trick, there's like a formula to know how to do it so that people outside of Trinidad are able to understand it. It's not just write the way we speak. You really do have to still craft the language to be understood by outsiders.
I think that's an excellent point that you've raised, because we were taught growing up, and I'm sure you were taught this as well, that how you speak is how you write, and how you write is how you speak. And that is something that was preached to us. But in respect to, let's just say, from basic skills growing up to the education system to now, is it that the teaching at those various stages are going to have to evolve as well? Or should we still be focusing on standard English, or as they say, and it's not a favorite term, but it's a term that's been used many times, the Queen's language, the Queen's English?
Mm-hmm. Well, you and I both know that is just an empty expression, the Queen's English, because if you listen to the Queen or King Charles or whoever, what our English, even at its best, is not the same, right? But it is an evolving conversation. I think in UWI, at tertiary level, like institutions, the debate has reached a point where they're considering Trinidad English and Trinidad Creole as a separate language, I shouldn't say a separate language, but a language in its own right. And so the question is being asked as to whether students should be allowed to submit written work in Trinidad English, in Trinidad Creole. That's the level that the debate has reached. Even in Belize, I lived in Belize and practiced law in Belize for 4 years, and there's a huge movement afoot to have Belize Creole considered as a language in its own right, and to be able to have that being used as the official language in some ways.
Because I don't know if you could see on the screen, the question I was asking is really, and I deliberately wrote it that way, how is Caribbean people supposed to talk?
Are we supposed to talk, boy?
Exactly. How are we supposed to talk? So because as you mentioned, it's in informal circles. You may find yourself speaking one version of English or one form of dialect, and then in more formal settings, you find yourself, am I pronouncing my words properly? Did I use that word correctly? And by the way, simple little things like when we were growing up. Again, I go back to that. If I were to say the word 1, 2, 3, I would get told off for that. Huh?
What about this one? That's my one.
That's my one. Yes. And
or mines.
Well, there's no such thing as mines. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
There's no such thing as mines. And even when we go into our local sayings, our creative quotations, she's sweet too bad.
Yes. But you know where that comes from? That comes from, again, the almost literal English translation of French phrases, like it making hot. It making hot is a literal translation of the French for il fait chaud or whatever is or assez calor, it makes hot, whatever it is, but it's a literal English translation of a foreign phrase, and that is why we speak the way we speak, because I think we have to embrace that we've always been what we call a polyglot nation. We've always had all these different linguistic inputs But I go back to saying, I feel like making the best use of that spectrum is treating and training our people how to continue to slide along it, to be able to communicate with practically anybody, who speaks English. There's some people in Trinidad, I think, today who are more fluent because of dancehall music, more fluent in Jamaican English than standard English, just because of it being the thing that they hear most or are exposed to. And there's nothing wrong with being fluent in Jamaican English. But can you, if the situation demands it, speak fluently in standard English? I think that's a skill that we have to encourage. We're encouraging, for years the government has been encouraging the implementation of Spanish as a second language. Well, let's work on English now.
I like these. Now, we are running out of time. I want to thank you for this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and opinions and your experiences with us. But I'd like to know more about your book, and particularly the book that you... There you go. Now, so, what is the title of that book?
Well, almost every man who has encountered the cover has said, pleasant view. Whereas others, it's pleasant view. It's pleasant view. That's the name of the book.
So, if you can, give us a synopsis of your book, of your writing.
So, Pleasant View was written during the time that I was doing my master's. It was my thesis. It's 9 interconnected stories set in Trinidad, in a community in Trinidad called Pleasant View that is modeled after a particular community that I will leave the readers to guess where. And it's not a well-to-do environment. It's not. And so we just follow the lives of these people as they go through their days, and I intended it to sort of be a microcosm of Trinidad. And it's written both in standard English and in Trinidad Creole. I go in between. Yeah, and it's meant to highlight a lot of the modern issues facing us in Trinidad. I've been told it's a fun read. Not fun in the light-hearted sense, but certainly fun. It's fun to see yourself, to see our culture reflected on the page.
Certainly. Where can we get a copy of this book to read? Where can viewers get a copy of this book?
Well, all the online places, but in Trinidad, I believe I've seen the book at Nigel Can booksellers. I've also seen it at Paper-Based Bookshop, which is in St. Clair, and I'm not sure where else. Probably Tales and Treasures, Scribbles and Quills. I mean, just ask. But I know for sure Paper-Based tends to have the book all the time.
Paper-Based really is very much supporting of local authors.
Yes, a huge resource, yes.
Definitely. So thank you very much for that. Well, I can certainly look forward to getting a copy of that book as well. And I'm glad that you before I even spoke to the title of the book, thank you very much for correcting.
Yes, no problem.
I think I find myself in a situation, though, with how things are evolving. Everything is constantly evolving. That oftentimes I wonder, and I've asked myself this question: if a word is spelled incorrectly in the dictionary, how could you tell? So think about that one for a moment. Miss Mohammed, thank you very much for joining me on the program this morning. Thank you very much for your time. It certainly has been a pleasure, and I look forward to our next conversation. And I'm putting you on the spot. Your next week.
Yes, thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Certainly. All the best. Take care.
Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, we take a break here on the program. Think about all that has been put forward during this particular conversation. Stimulate your opinion, and you can reach out to us at AM Prime and tell us what you think. We'd love to hear from you. We'll return after these messages.